Okay. So I will now pass everything over to Professor LoBianco. So welcome everybody again. Over to you, Joseph.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I assume people can hear me. Alex, how do I get this PowerPoint going
All right.
again?
Okay. So we'll just go through this here. So all you need to do is you go to the new share as we did last time.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Sorry, I forgot about that. Okay. I just want to say good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. It's a pleasure to be with you. I hope this works well. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. There'll be 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. Please write them on the chat facility there, and we'll pick them out and answer them as we go along. So let's take it away. Okay, assuming that everything's going well and you can see the, you can see the first sheet of my presentation, which says the language lives of young migrant children, pressure, identity, and connection. Basically, this talk is an invitation for us to see the work that we do as teachers, as managers of community language schools. I don't know your backgrounds, everyone, but there must be some people who are also researchers, parents, tutors, people who work in and around the community languages sector, to see our work from the point of view of children. I think this is a missing element in the work that many people do, unfortunately, because the children are young and we often imagine that they don't have ideas or opinions about the language teaching enterprise, but I've done quite a lot of research with young children and they certainly do. I also am going to draw on some international studies that have been done and some experiences from different parts of the world, but most of it will be looking at the language life of a child from the point of view of experience. So the wider context, as you can see in this particular slide here, is that last year was the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and the United Nations was so happy with how the year proceeded and the good work that was done that it decided in late 2019 to extend that year for a decade, to an entire decade, starting 2022. And this will give countries the opportunity to do very substantial work because it takes a long time to turn around the problem of language endangerment. And language endangerment is the reality for many, many indigenous languages in the world. They're endangered, meaning that they are likely to be lost, or many of them will be lost. And that's a point to start also in relation to migrant languages. And I want to introduce this distinction, this difference between two kinds of endangerment, two kinds of endangered languages. Languages that are endangered locally, that is in Australia, and you can see my example there. If Marathi or Greek are no longer spoken in New South Wales, they're lost locally. That would be extremely sad, of course, and we should try very hard to make sure that never happens, but they would still be spoken somewhere else in the world. So it would be local endangerment for the language, meaning that the language would lose speakers here, but the language itself is vibrant and vital somewhere else. However, if Gumbaynggirr and Wiradjuri are no longer spoken in New South Wales, or indeed anywhere in Australia, then they're not locally endangered, they're actually globally endangered. They're endangered in their very existence. So here we can see that from this extreme example, perhaps, that what's involved in the work that you do is something that's globally significant, that's connected to people in other parts of the world, and from the point of view of culture, is very, very important for the world in general. So migration is one of the great stories of Australian life, of course, and especially the migration, for example, of the post-Second World War era that brought my family to Australia. As you can see, the picture in the top left is the kind of migration story of my parents in the 1950s. But it's also a story of earlier migration during the 19th century, of refugee populations, of multiple kinds of migrations from many parts of the world. And we share this migration story with other societies of immigration. The most famous one, of course, is the United States. Many societies of migration, of out-migration, of people who've departed to go to other parts of the world, are now societies of immigration. Just before starting, Alex and I were talking about parts of Italy that now host large numbers of immigrants. So the world is on the move. And these parts of Italy that host immigrants were areas from which large numbers of people left in the really for almost 150 years now, people have been leaving there. So what we have is a world on the move. And this is the idea that a lot of people are starting to appreciate now of mobility. Mobility, if we try and think of people, we tend to think of them related to a country or a place. Increasingly, we start to think of people related to several places or being permanently mobile. Now, in New York, in the 1960s and 70s, a very important professor by the name of Joshua Fishman started work on migration to the United States and the language effects of this migration. And he put forward this idea, which I and Professor Michael Klein and other people in Australia have developed a lot further, where he talked about the model of language shift. And language shift means the loss of the language of the home and the transfer of the communication of the family to the second language of the host society. Now, in both the United States and Australia, that's English. So here we have a distinction between the home language, the host language, and the interaction through the children between the two. And what Professor Fishman talked about was that in general, it's not true everywhere, of course, for some communities it's 4G, meaning 4 generations. For other communities it's 1G. In the first generation, the parents, the actual migrants, themselves start using English with their children and make the shift very quickly. And this means that the children are actually brought up in English. But that's very, very rare. The vast majority of communities go through this process, which means that the vast majority of migrant languages are locally endangered. They are lost in 3 generations. This doesn't mean everyone stops using them, but it means that many, many people do, and there is a loss of the whole community's strength in the language. So in the first generation, the home is mostly a place where Marathi or Greek or Italian or Spanish or Chinese or whatever the language happens to be is spoken between the parents and the children. So it's a multi-generational language used between older people middle-aged people, and children. So the early learning that children do and what's called their socialization, how they learn to be social beings, all that happens in the first language. In the second generation, with the second generation, what tends to happen is they become stronger in English because they're younger, they're going out to school, they're being taught in school. The parents have less contact with learning situations themselves. They have to work. There are lots of reasons why this happens. And so a divide grows up between the generations, and the connection is bilingual. And it's usually the parents using the home language, the children understanding it and often replying in English, the parents understanding the English but replying in the mother tongue. This is very common. It doesn't happen to everybody, but it's very common. And then in the third generation, the children of the first generation are now parents themselves, and they raise their children in English. This also happens because they outmarry. Many of them marry outside of the community, and English becomes the common language between the father and mother of new children. Now, of course, this is a simplification. It's much more complicated and there are different nuances. But in general, in a very broad pattern, the language lives of children are depicted like this, as a transition. That is a transition from one thing to another. And if we think that those children could be full bilinguals, we can call that transition subtractive. Something is taken away. It's like a calculation, you subtract something. Now, if an English-speaking child goes to school and learns a second language, their English is not going to be lost. It's the dominant language of America and Australia. And if they learn a second language, let's say that they learn Vietnamese or they learn German or whatever they learn, they're adding something. So that's an additive form of language transition. So the language lives of these children are, at any one time that we look at them, they're in a process of going somewhere, going towards more languages or away from them. And the work that you do, and the work that we all try to do, is to make much, much more additive solutions prevail and fewer subtractive ones. I want to say, though, that it isn't just a transition between one language and another. As you can see on this slide, there are quite a few other issues involved. Many of you listening will have this experience. It's certainly my experience, that our personal names are changed in the process of going from one to the other. Family names are changed. Children struggle with pronunciation, and there are struggles about accents. The mother tongue, the language of the home, is maintained often more passively than actively. And as you can see there, I say the public use of the mother tongue. In some of the research I've done, but it was also the experience of myself and many other people, there's embarrassment about using the mother tongue in a public space. This is less than it used to be, I have to say. I think it was worse once. And it's a very bad thing. But we have to understand what's going on, why children don't want to be seen to be using a language that's different from their friends' ones, usually English. So the language life of the child is often a struggle with these things. And then there is English, of course. And here there are many aspects of English. There's English as it's spoken in school, English as it's spoken with the friends. There are other transitions between different scripts. If you have a language at home, it might be an Indian language which uses a script that's very different from the alphabet that English uses, which is the Latin alphabet. Or you might use, you might be from Russian, or you might use a Cyrillic script, which is also an alphabet, but it's still different from Latin. There's also issues here that come up in our research. And then in many schools, they teach additional languages, and children are learning these third languages. And then you can see there representing the language and the community you come from. By this, I mean that children are often assumed to represent the whole community. Teachers see them that way in mainstream schools sometimes. And this is pressure on them. Sometimes in a shopping center, we had one child in one particular bit of research we did who was from an African community. And the way the shopkeeper kept speaking to this person was as though this child was not just an individual, but in fact the whole community. And we need to keep in mind that this is a big pressure on children. We have to help them and support them to see that we put that pressure on them too. We want them to keep the language. And so we want them to be a champion for our language. But their desire to do this is very important. They have to share our desire for it to happen. We have to include them and their feelings in what we do and how we plan things. So you can see on the slide there at the bottom, I say the language lives of children are part of this complicated process of transition. In many cases, as I said, it's towards loss instead of towards what we should everyone aim to get, which is fully literate, proficient bilingualism. And community language families and homes give this great gift, this great donation to the entire Australian community of another language, something that the whole society should welcome. It's a donation, as I call it. And I think that unfortunately, there's not enough appreciation of how important this is. Now, I'm going to say that actually migration today is very different from how it used to be. The studies of migration show that children are affected by this, as you can see in this slide, in many different ways. Some of our research shows that some children are left behind by migrant parents because they don't want them to have the trauma of moving, or they can't afford it, or for other reasons. Other children do accompany their migrating parents. That's the majority situation. Incredibly, very large numbers of children migrate by themselves. In Europe, this is an enormous problem. Huge numbers of children on boats, completely independent of any adults. And of course, some children do not move, but are impacted by migration because they live in communities where there are large numbers of migrants. And some children go back to where they came from originally, and they have to re-migrate and reimagine themselves in a new environment. All of these forms of movement and mobility have language issues with them. And children make a mixture, what we're going to call a hybrid, a mixture of all of the language experiences in all of the environments in which they live. They have language lives, and these language lives are unique. They're not like their parents. They're not like their relatives left back home, and they're not like the mainstream community in the society they move into. The language lives of these children are special and they're unique. Many of them are bilingual. Most of them go to schools, however, that turn them into monolinguals. And that's definitely the last thing on earth that we should do. That's what you and the New South Wales Federation, of course, are trying to stop. Many migrant children, even today, do interpreting work for adults, even for their own parents, because they tend to learn English faster than their parents. This is part of their language life, the experience of being a mediator. And when these children become adolescents, there's often a very, it's a stressful time in families, normally in all families everywhere. Children want to become independent, want to become, psychologists call it individuation, where they become individuals. They want to make their mark. They want to be seen to be an individual and go out and do whatever they want to do. In migrant families, if there's a gap between the language and communication of the home, between the parents and the children, this challenge can become very severe. So community language maintenance is a very important thing, not just because of cultural reasons. It's very important for cultural reasons, not just for intellectual reasons. It's very important for intellectual reasons, but for well-being and health and communication and connection with the wider family. So often children are like this sheep. They're stuck between two rocks. The family, which might be sometimes attached to the original home, and the local community that doesn't always accept them. We have many different words for talking about migrant children, and I think that some of them are better than others. In the United States, they usually talk about heritage languages and heritage learners. In Australia, we use, and I prefer myself very much, the word community languages, because it suggests that the languages are part of the community around the child and they're alive. A heritage suggests something that's faded away already. Sometimes they're called ethnic languages, and people don't like calling that anymore. We call the children bilingual children, sometimes dialect speakers, sometimes subtractive learners, sometimes culturally and linguistically diverse learners. Sometimes they have language backgrounds other than English. Sometimes we say they are NESB children, children from non-English speaking backgrounds. So we define them by something that they don't have, that is English, or they're gaining. So all of these terms exist, and there's nothing that's perfect. Some of them are bad. Some people call them semi-linguals, not fully linguistically proficient in the home and not fully linguistically proficient in English. And that is a terrible term, which we should never use, because children always have a full language system, even if it's a hybrid. It's a full system to think with and communicate with. It might be passive knowledge of home language, but they're still understanding to communicate back to the parents. And they're developing active knowledge of English. So the lives of children are always in transition, and in any one time, they have got a full language system. We should never see children as lacking things, as having a deficit. They're gaining and adding, of course, but they're not overcoming a deficit. If we think of people having a deficit, we tend to treat them in a way that's not helpful. They have a full language system. Now, in Australia, there's now more and more talk, but it's mostly talk, unfortunately, of thinking about these communities as diasporas for Australia. That is a community of migrants still connected with a home country who can provide assets for Australia in trade, in international connections, etc., etc. And there was a big report pictured on this slide that you can see now, which talks about this diaspora as being an advantage for Australia. And I am in two minds about this. I can see it's got some advantage because it means that government is at least listening to the cultural knowledge and language knowledge that children and families have, and seeing that this is a big asset for them and for the whole community. But the reason we want to maintain languages is because people have a right to this, in my opinion, because of the reasons I gave before, the well-being and health and intellectual development of children, and the connection within families across generations. But it is something to watch, and I suggest that you keep an eye on this if you're interested in policy. The whole idea of diaspora is actually taking off. There are many parts of the world where people are thinking that in a global world, A migrant's original home and their new home, the link between them is a plus, a benefit, an advantage. This goes back to the idea I said at the beginning of mobility. When this pandemic is fully over, and I hope that's very soon, of course, like everybody, we will see that the world, even when we can't physically move, is very connected globally. We're doing it now with Zoom. People can connect with people in a way than when my parents came to Australia. They had 6 or 7 or 8 weeks between sending a letter and the other party receiving the letter. That's not connection, really. What we have today is instant connection in which you can see people, talk to them, hear their voices, see them and how, and they can see you. So this is all giving rise to a new philosophy where we see movement and mobility as a strength, not a weakness. And some of the implications of this I've got down the bottom. Instead of seeing language maintenance as the goal, maybe we should see flexible language use, the ability of children to swap between languages as a good thing, a positive thing. It shows that they exist in different domains, in different environments. They can switch, make the most of these. You don't have to have a full command of all the languages you know. You just need to be able to use them in the environments that they're useful for you to have. It's good to have full command of at least 2, of course, but I think language behavior is much more complicated than just seeing blocks of one language separate from another language. In all of this, I want to just talk about a study I did a few years ago of what also unites all children in Australia. This was a study we did for the Oxford University Press, and we called it The Words That Children Write. And what we tried to do was to count the words, the first words that children write. And we did this because we wanted to tap into the world of the imagination of children, free from the influence of adults as much as we could get, teachers and parents. And we collected 73,430 words from boys. These were texts that we got from them, little stories they wrote, free writing we called it, and 86,808 from girls. And there were writing samples in year 1, year 2, and year 3. So a really large database of the first 3 years of school, and we counted 307 words that children consistently wrote. We then compared this to the last time a study like this was done 30 years ago in Australia, and we found many, many changes that are relevant to all children, migrant children, Aboriginal children, mainstream English-speaking children, and they're listed down the bottom there. Children everywhere across Australia are much less formal now. Mr. and Mrs. has practically disappeared. No one writes them. They weren't in the first 500 words of the children. Mother and father are hardly there. There's a big increase in technological language, in activities language, and in ownership language. Me and mine were much more common in words, in stories that children write today than in the past. So we had these big changes, but what we found is that the first 100 words that all children wrote were identical. And the most common word was I. I mean, children, of course, are focused on themselves. The second most common word was the, because they were naming something. Mum was number 34 and dad number 35. So these were basically a common, what we call a common verbal base of culture. After we get beyond 100 words, we start to see that girls write differently from boys and start to express themselves in different ways. Children in rural areas start to write and use words that are quite different from urban children in towns and cities, and bilingual or migrant children start to appear as a special category. And the most important thing that distinguished the migrant children from all the others was family. Children of migrant background had many words for food events, for family events, and for relatives. Words like cousin, which we never found in any stories that any uh, mainstream children wrote. We found it quite commonly after the first 100 with migrant children. Words for grandparents, so a wider extended family. Ate, eating, and words like that started to show up. I'm telling you this because I want to say that language lives of children are also shared, of migrant children. They share a lot of common life with all children, and they also have distinctive different lives that are special in their own context. And look, I won't talk about this very much, but we've tracked this against the systems of the microsystem of the child. If we focus on the immediate environment of the child and his or her family, immediate family, the various connections, the indirect environment, social and cultural values, etc., we can see a growing out pattern, and this is reflected in language. But there's no one pattern of trajectory through their lives. It's not the straight line that you can see in the bottom, I guess that's on the left side, the bottom left side of that image there. What basically it looks like is perhaps more like the aeroplane on the right. There's certain ages in children's lives where they don't want to use the home language very much. They don't want to be seen to be using it. They don't want their parents to use it in public. So they go backwards. This doesn't stop them being knowledgeable of the language. There's just something else going on in their psychological life. And then they might get over that and they have another growth spurt. This is the way a lot of language development happens. It's not a straightforward line. There's a Polish professor in the United Kingdom by the name of Thomas Bak, B-A-K, who with some colleagues has put together what he calls the healthy linguistic diet. And he argues that we have regular physical activity and a healthy diet because we want to maintain our physical health. And research that he and other people have done on the brain shows us that regular use and learning of languages is essential mental exercise too. So the pathway of going back and forward, we should never worry about. It's normal that the language use and ability of children will reflect what's happening in their lives. We need to build what Professor Bak here calls cognitive reserve, better brain health through encountering many more languages, learning them better, using them more. And this results in a lot of benefits, including for mental health, later onset of dementia, the illness of dementia, which is a terrible illness. People who have a high level ability in languages and know them and use them have and get dementia tend to get it later than people who only know one language. Can you please turn off the microphone? Then there is an improved outcome after a stroke for bilinguals. So we can promote bilingualism for many, many, many reasons. I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I think we're going a bit slow. I'll make sure that I make available to you all of these, the PowerPoint slides, so you can see them yourself in your own time. So when we look at this world of mobility, we can see that everyone will have to deal with 3 languages, at least. The mother tongues, the languages of the family and the home, the national languages of the community they live in, if they're different from each other, and international languages as well. And what we want to do is actually to develop a way in which the schools can help the language lives of children in these three areas to be very rich and successful. And the best way to do this is to attach to the work that you do in the community language schools something like the model that I'm going to call COD. And this means capacity, opportunity, and desire. To help children maintain the language that they're learning in your school, to help them use it, we need to do each of these three things. Capacity is building up the knowledge that children have of the language. But studying a language is not enough to use it and appreciate it and identify with it. They need opportunities to use it. So the schools should create opportunities that are not just teaching. They have to be activity-based domains of using the language to get things done. Having a language law is not enough. Languages are not like other subjects in the curriculum. We have to do special things with them, because the last of these points, D for desire, goes back to what I'm saying about the language lives of children. Their desire to want to use this language is something that in your schools and in our families we can cultivate, and we must do this. Capacity is needed for language learning and maintenance, because the more capability a speaker has in the target language, the more they will use it. And we develop it informally in the home, in what's called intimacy, and formally in school, in what's called instruction. But on its own, capacity is not enough to lead to frequent use of the second language. We need opportunities to use the language because they're important to success. Without domains in which the target language is used, that is the home language, if we don't offer children an opportunity to do that, the 3G pattern will become very strong. And then finally, and the most important one, is desire. How do we convert the ability of children that they learn in the classroom into the desire to continue to use it? And here we must understand their language lives. I'm going to, excuse me, somebody has got the microphone on. Can you please turn it off? I'm just going to finish with one slide and to tell you a very brief story. This is a fence post very similar to the one near the school I used to go to. Many of the children that I went to school with would count the number of posts halfway, up to halfway point on the way to school. When they got to halfway, they would stop being the home language, leave behind their family identity and become the school person. And then on the way home, they would do the opposite. We have to stop children having to make such an extreme choice in their life. I might end it there. Thank you. Alex?
Yes.
Joe, you can mute everybody.
Yes, I think, Joe, if you could just mute everybody from your end, please.
I can do that, can I? Yes.
Yes, like we did before. If you can just go to the participants and just mute all. I'll do that now, okay? Except for me. So I'm going to leave this. I'll go back to you. I'll give it to you. Actually, I'll do this. And here we go. And I will actually, we can continue very shortly. We'll just make sure that everybody keeps everything off. And I'll just, I'll make you the host again very, very shortly. So just bear with us. It's very, very interesting, by the way, Joe. Thank you very much. I'll just hand it back to you. There we go. Back to you now. All yours, Joe. The only thing is, Joe, I know that you can hear me. You just need to unmute your, you need to unmute yourself, please, Joe. You can either do that with the space bar while you speak, or just press the microphone. Bear with us just a moment. There we go. Good. Very good.
There we go. I just wanted to, I don't know how much people heard with the interruption. Can people see, Alex, can people see this slide now?
Yes. It's all back to normal. Thank you.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I was finishing by pointing out that the language lives of children are something we should talk to them about. We should try and understand on a normal day and over a week, maybe asking them to keep a little diary, or we can help do it with them, or we can draw an outline of a person and ask them to name where the different languages that they use relate to them, so that one might be associated with sport or home or learning or something, just so that we can start conversations with them to build a more integrated way for the whole of their life. And I was telling the story to finish that when I was going to school in my primary school years, there was a fence a bit like this one between the school and my home, or the close to the school. And when we got to this fence, quite a few of the children would actually count the fence posts until they got to halfway. When they got to halfway, they would stop being who they were at home and become a new person to be at school. And when they were coming home, they would do the opposite. They would stop being the school person and they would become the home person. I think most children experience something like this, a separation between home and school. But for many migrant children, it's too extreme, and it forces them to make choices or to become distant from either one or the other. And a proper, full, healthy linguistic diet, a full supportive school that thinks about the desire of children themselves and their identity and asks them to describe their attitudes and feelings about languages, can help overcome some of the feelings of trauma that children have. And we can build the full bilinguals that should be our aim. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. What we will do now, if anyone has any questions, if anyone's got any questions for Joe, please, you can please put them in the chat, and we will take it from there. Any questions, please write them in the chat. And we'll avoid using the microphones as yes, okay, lots of thank yous again. Okay. Feel free to ask questions. This is your chance to ask. All right. I think what we'll do, yes, I might just take some of these questions. We do have a question regarding Joe. Somebody asked where we can find your material published.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yes.
There is a repository or a site on the web called ResearchGate. That's two words, but they're linked up, research and gate. And if you just go onto ResearchGate, or you search ResearchGate with my name, it brings up a lot of publications. Most of them are free and completely available for download there.
Okay. So what we'll do is I'll take okay. Can you show the references again? Yes. If I could just add, Joe, we can actually see your screen still, and I will. If you can just open. Okay, that's fine. We're just going to remind you, everybody, that the material will be made available to you. It'll be on the Federation's Google Classroom, and the recording will be also available on the Federation's YouTube channel. There will be quite a bit of other material there as well, other master classes. Joe, if you can still hear us, someone, Nicole Kim, is asking. She was interested to find out what the first, I suppose this is the Dolch list, the first 100 words that were according to your research in 2008.
What was the question? Sorry.
So Nicole Kim is asking about a Dolch list. So she was wondering what the first 100 words were according to your research in 2008. I don't expect you to remember them all.
They're listed on the publication, which you can get from the ResearchGate site. I'm happy to send it to, a proper published one for anyone who would like that. If you could just contact me, maybe through Alex.
Sure.
Because I've got a good PDF of that. I can't remember. I do know all of them, but I do know that they're quite surprising, and a lot of them to do with technology, with activity, and with me. Children write a lot about themselves, obviously, about their experiences and what's important to them. And what's really interesting about this research is that it's actually quite moving in some ways, because you see the fears, but also the hopes and desires. When children do free writing, they often are very, very honest about things that maybe they wouldn't say to someone. So it's quite revealing in that way.
Thank you. There are quite a few questions, Joe. We've got a couple of minutes to go. How do you, well, here's one from Andrea Bommers from the Deutschstunde German school here in Sydney. So how do you encourage migrant children to keep using their languages?
Well, this is part of the Desire method. It's really important to do this around age-based activity and linking people with peers, people of their own age. You're from a German school, so within a German-speaking country or another environment, around shared activities in which the normalized language of communication is German. So you have to set it up in a way that the activity functions in the language you want them to use. And it's quite easy to do. They do very wonderful things like this in Ireland with Irish language immersion. There are quite established methodologies, but they have to start from consultation with the children, understanding what turns them on, what they're interested in, helping them to co-design it with you, and then doing them regularly. So within those activities, you also inject learning and teaching opportunities. So it's not just sport or fun, but it's sport and fun with specific learning aims.
Okay. Just looking at some of these we've had some pretty interesting questions, Joe. There's one in particular from Ivan Chan who basically asks, he says, it seems like language has its own status in relation to its economic or political power. If a country has less economic or political impact, how can we enhance people to maintain their ethnic language?
Oh, it's very interesting, because all the research I've done with children and their ideas about language, they never, government reports always talk about trade and opportunity, but children don't think that way. And jobs, certainly not at the primary school level or even junior secondary. In my research, and I've done interviews with hundreds of children, and I've done little focus groups and other kinds of activities, and there's never been an example. They might say something like jobs, but they're not very big motivators. One study that we did in the western suburbs of Melbourne with students doing Japanese and Italian, and what we found we classified the children That were students really, not little children by this stage, as waverers, the ones who were thinking of dropping the language, and people who were really committed. So the committed ones and the waverers. And the waverers, the reason they were not interested in going on or thinking of dropping it was almost entirely to do with teachers, teaching, curriculum, things like that. They had nothing to do with the language concerned or with anything to do with jobs or what you might do afterwards. When you talk to them in focus groups, they would say, yes, it's, you know, I might be able to have a career as a journalist if I know these languages or whatever. But in the end, what made them continue or not continue was really about the quality of the teaching and learning.
Okay. I'm just looking for lots of comments, lots of thank yous, by the way. Lots of very positive feedback here, Joe. So, gosh, very long questions. Let's see. Okay, what I'd like to add before we wrap up, actually, is if anyone is interested, the Federation is going to be. Thank you to the. I have to say thank you to Nina Konomos as well, and to the Community Languages Schools program that is assisting with the funding of the material that we're providing. We will be purchasing the publications. And we will be, this is the Federation of Community Language Schools, will be making them available to our community languages teachers. So if anyone is interested in furthering your readings, please get in touch with me or anyone at the Federation. Okay, so, yes.
Alex, can I make a suggestion?
Please.
There's an activity that was invented by an Austrian professor by the name of Brigitte Busch, which is something I'll recommend to you that I think schools can do with students, where it's an activity that opens up discussion about what languages mean to the individual student. Families can do them as well. All the bits and pieces aren't coming to my mind right now, but I'll send the information to you. And these are freely available and they're quite interesting, and kids really enjoy doing this activity, and it's a point of opening a discussion between teachers and children and parents and children about language maintenance, so the children become supporters of what you're trying to do. That's what I think we can gain by taking their desires and feelings more seriously. They can become very supportive. And, you know, when you learn to read, it's like you have a new teacher, because you have your regular teacher, and then your reading ability helps you to learn as well. If we take children's desires seriously and interact with them in a way that's respectful, they can become participants in helping us to teach them better.
Okay, all right. Joe, when are we going to be getting a national languages policy, do you think?
I can't say. I don't know. Tomorrow.
Yes, I know you've been working on this for a while, but okay. Look, if I can just say to everybody, thank you very much again for participating. I'm just going to come back to this. Hopefully you'll be able to see this screen here. And thank you everybody for spending some time with us. Thank you, Professor Joe LoBianco. Excellent presentation, and we will see you hopefully again on another occasion. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Alex. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Good night.